It was a sweltering July night in 1952. The air in Washington, D.C. hung heavy, unmoving, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Tourists strolled past the glowing Capitol dome, lovers sat along the Potomac, and the White House stood quiet, its windows lit only by a few late-night staffers. To the citizens, it was just another summer evening. But to the men watching radar screens at Washington National Airport, it was the beginning of a nightmare. At 11:40 p.m., the first blip appeared. Small, faint, a stray echo perhaps, but then another joined it, and another. Within minutes, a cluster of strange objects filled the screen, moving slowly at first, then darting in impossible bursts of speed. Controllers exchanged uneasy glances. No scheduled flights matched these paths. No aircraft could make such maneuvers. One operator leaned closer to his glowing green scope and whispered, "They're right over the White House." The room tensed. Phones rang. Calls went out to Andrews Air Force Base. Military radar confirmed the same thing. Unknowns moving over the nation's capital. And they weren't birds. They weren't balloons. They weren't anything ordinary. Meanwhile, outside, ordinary citizens began to look up. Over the Washington Monument, pale lights glided silently, hovering, then streaking away faster than the eye could follow. Taxi drivers pulled to the curb, craning their necks. Tourists gasped and pointed. One woman swore she saw 3 glowing discs drift above the Potomac before vanishing like smoke. By midnight, the city was alive with rumor. And inside the Pentagon, phones rang off the hook. A swarm of unidentified flying objects was in restricted airspace, the most protected sky in the United States. At 12:30 a.m., jet fighters were scrambled. The roar of engines tore through the night as F-94 Starfires clawed their way into the sky. Pilots scanned the darkness, eyes straining, instruments glowing. And then, suddenly, there they were, lights, brilliant white, darting ahead of the jets, impossible to close in on. One pilot radioed back, "They're moving faster than anything I've ever seen." "I can't get near them." His voice cracked with disbelief. On the ground, controllers listened as the jets gave chase, only to lose the objects in an instant, as though they had simply winked out of existence. Back in the city, the sightings multiplied. Dozens of people, then hundreds, all watching the same lights dance above the nation's monuments. They zigzagged, stopped in midair, shot straight up, then glowed faintly before fading away. Some described them as saucer-shaped, glowing from within. Others swore they looked like orbs, fiery and alive. By dawn, Washington was buzzing. Newspapers rushed to print extras with screaming headlines. "Flying saucers over Capitol." Taxi drivers swapped stories. Policemen admitted they had seen them too. Even hardened skeptics were rattled. After all, this wasn't a story from a farm town or a desert highway. This was the capital of the United States, and the evidence was undeniable. The military's explanation? None. Reporters pressed for answers, but officials stayed silent. Behind closed doors, however, panic rippled through the Pentagon. If these were Soviet craft, they had violated the heart of American airspace with ease. If they weren't Soviet, then what were they? And as the sun rose over Washington on July 20th, 1952, the city braced itself, because the nightmare was only beginning. The lights would return, the radar screens would flare again, and the White House itself would soon be forced to address the impossible. That night, the skies over Washington, D.C. had become a battlefield, not of weapons, but of fear, secrets and questions too dangerous to answer. 1 week later, just as the city began to calm, the lights returned. It was the night of July 26, 1952. The heat over Washington was suffocating, a heavy blanket pressing down on the city. At National Airport, radar operators were restless. The previous week had shaken them, but perhaps it was over. Perhaps. Then, at 8:15 p.m., the first unknown appeared on the scope. Within minutes, there were more. Dozens of them, darting in and out of the radar sweep. Controllers stared in disbelief. They were back. And outside, the skies confirmed it. Pilots approaching the Capitol reported glowing lights streaking past their aircraft. Ground observers saw fiery discs hovering over the city. Taxi drivers stopped mid-route, pointing to the sky. Families spilled out of their homes to watch as the silent intruders danced above the monuments of power. This time, the military was ready. F-94 jets screamed into the night, roaring off runways in pursuit of the intruders. But once again, the story was the same. Pilots closed in only for the glowing objects to vanish. Some would reappear behind the jets, taunting them, darting away faster than any known aircraft. On the ground, tension grew unbearable. In the White House, President Harry Truman was briefed. For the first time, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States was faced with the possibility that his capital was under invasion, not from the Soviets, but from something else entirely. He demanded answers, and he wanted them fast. The press, too, was relentless. Headlines blared across the country. Saucers swarm over Washington again. Radio announcers shouted about invasion skies. The public, already uneasy in the shadow of the Cold War, whispered fears of Soviet superweapons, or worse. Inside the Pentagon, explanations were thin. Weather phenomena, optical illusions, temperature inversions. None of it held up against radar data, pilot testimony, and the sheer number of civilian witnesses. The pressure grew so intense that the Air Force called an emergency press conference. It was the largest since World War II, packed with reporters, flashing cameras, and nervous officials. They insisted the sightings were nothing more than radar quirks, tricks of the atmosphere. No threat to national security, they repeated. But outside that room, few believed it. The pilots had seen them. The controllers had tracked them. The citizens had watched them with their own eyes. And the objects had hovered above the very heart of America's power. By the end of July, the sightings faded. The skies grew quiet. But Washington was left with questions no one could answer. Why here? Why then? And what had they witnessed? Soviet technology, mass hysteria, or something from beyond the Earth itself? The events of those 2 July nights became known as the Washington Flap. For many, it was proof that the government knew more than it admitted. For others, it was a moment when the impossible briefly stepped into the light, right above the Capitol dome. And in the silence that followed, a new fear took root. If they could appear here above the seat of power itself, then nowhere was safe. The panic had reached its peak. 2 weekends in a row, the skies over Washington, D.C. had been invaded by objects no one could explain. Radar operators, airline pilots, fighter jet crews, and hundreds of civilians had seen them. And now the president himself demanded answers. The Air Force was cornered. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't explain it. So they did the only thing left. They tried to bury it. On July 29, 1952, the Pentagon hosted the largest press conference since World War II. Dozens of journalists crammed into the room. Cameras flashed. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and suspicion. At the front sat Major General John Samford, Director of Air Force Intelligence, flanked by other high-ranking officers. Samford began calmly, but his words betrayed the pressure he was under. He admitted the sightings were real: radar blips, eyewitness accounts, even intercept attempts by fighter jets. But then came the pivot. It wasn't alien. It wasn't even Soviet. It was weather. Temperature inversions, Samford declared. A quirk of hot air trapped above cool layers of atmosphere, which he claimed could cause radar illusions and glowing lights in the sky. That, he insisted, explained everything. The reporters weren't convinced. Many pressed for details, for contradictions in the official story. Some asked outright if the Air Force was hiding the truth. Samford repeated his line: no threat to national security, no reason for panic, just the weather. But outside the Pentagon walls, no one believed it. Radar operators had tracked the objects maneuvering, making turns, accelerating, vanishing, things temperature inversions could not do. Pilots had seen lights pacing their jets, darting away at impossible speeds. Civilians had watched glowing discs hover over monuments. The public had witnessed an invasion in their skies, and the Air Force had answered with humidity. Inside Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation, the Washington incidents caused turmoil. Investigators privately admitted the case was one of the most credible and troubling they had ever seen. But the official files told another story. The sightings were written off as temperature inversion effects. Case closed. For many, it was a turning point. Citizens, journalists, even some scientists began to suspect that the government was not just clueless, but actively covering up the truth. The words flying saucers and cover-up began to fuse in the public imagination. And yet, the incident was quietly buried. Official history reduced it to radar tricks and hysteria. But those who had been there, the controllers, the pilots, the families staring at the skies, never forgot what they saw. The Washington flap was more than a UFO sighting. It was a test, a moment when the unknown stepped boldly into the most protected airspace in the world, and the government showed it was powerless or unwilling to respond. For the first time, the American public realized a chilling truth. If something could invade the skies above the White House, then perhaps the people in charge weren't in control after all. By the time the lights faded from the Washington sky, something had changed in America. It wasn't just about saucers or radar blips anymore. It was about trust. The government had stood before its citizens, offered a neat explanation, temperature inversions, and expected them to believe it. But too many had seen with their own eyes. Too many had heard the pilots' voices on the radio. The truth had slipped through, and no official statement could erase it. For many, July 1952 was the moment the UFO phenomenon became real. Not a rural legend, not whispers from farmers or fishermen, but a crisis in the capital itself. The seat of power had been violated by the unknown, and the unknown had left without a trace. In the years that followed, the Washington sightings haunted the Air Force. Project Blue Book, tasked with cataloging and dismissing reports, struggled with the case. Privately, officers admitted it was one of the most credible, most disturbing incidents they had ever handled. Publicly, they stuck to the script: weather, illusion, nothing more. But the people didn't forget. The phrase "flying saucers over Washington" became shorthand for government secrecy and impotence. Newspapers kept the clippings alive. Radio shows replayed eyewitness interviews. The image of glowing discs hovering over the Capitol dome burned itself into American folklore. Culturally, it was explosive. Hollywood took notice. Sci-fi films of the 1950s, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, Invasion of the Saucermen, were fueled by the idea that the skies were not safe. that the unknown could appear without warning, even above the White House itself. Politically, it was terrifying. The Cold War was at its height. Americans feared Soviet bombers, nuclear annihilation, invisible enemies. To admit that unknown craft could penetrate Washington's airspace was to admit weakness. To admit they weren't Soviet at all was to admit something worse. That control was an illusion. And so, the Washington flap was buried. Official files marked explained, public interest redirected. But in the shadows of history, it lingered. UFO researchers would return to it again and again, calling it one of the strongest cases of all time, not for wreckage or bodies, but for sheer audacity. Because here, the phenomenon hadn't hidden in the desert or over remote mountains. It hadn't chosen lonely roads or isolated witnesses. It had appeared above the heart of American power, where the world was watching. And for 2 long July nights, the capital of the United States was forced to look up and face something it could neither fight nor explain. The legacy of the Washington UFO invasion is not just in the lights themselves, but in the silence that followed, in the knowledge that when the impossible came, the authorities chose to explain it away rather than confront it. It is a story of fear, of secrecy, and of a question that still hangs above us. If they could come here once, what stops them from coming again? And perhaps they already have. Perhaps even tonight, above the monuments and domes of power, the skies are not empty, but watching. The Washington flap remains a scar in American history, a reminder that the greatest mystery does not lie in the question of whether UFOs exist, but in the way our world reacts when they appear.